Good morning and welcome back. For those of you who listened to us earlier, welcome to those of you who are just joining now. Welcome to the public policy stage and to this session, which will be focused on regulation in the age of AI. My name is Florian Ostmann. I'm the head of AI governance and regulatory innovation within the public policy programs, within the Turing's public policy program. And it's a pleasure to be able to welcome you to this session. Regulation has been a recurring topic at previous editions of AI UK. We've usually always had a session on regulation. In many ways, the past year has been a particularly eventful year in the regulation space for AI. So I'm particularly excited about the session today. There are a number of developments, I think, that really have added speed and sort of concreteness to discussions around AI regulation over the last year. At the domestic level within the UK, those developments include the government's commitment to develop and publish a white paper on the regulation and governance of AI, and we will hear more about that white paper work later on. There are also other relevant legislative and regulatory developments in the UK, such as the Online Safety Bill, which we've already heard about at the conference yesterday, or the government's plan for digital regulation, just to mention some examples. There are also important developments at the international level and developments in other jurisdictions that will have implications for stakeholders in the UK. The perhaps most prominent example here is the EU's proposed AI Act, which is a proposed piece of EU-wide regulation for AI systems, covering a wide range of applications and contexts that will have implications for any AI business in the UK, for example, that seeks to access EU markets. All of this is to say there have been a lot of developments underway in the regulatory space as it relates to AI, both in the UK and internationally, and I'm delighted that we'll have an opportunity today to dive deeper into those questions, and particularly delighted that we have an illustrious group of experts to discuss those questions with us. We will begin the session with an opening speech from Julia Black, who is joining us remotely. She's going to share some remarks on the topic from her side for about 10 to 15 minutes, and we'll then pass on to a panel discussion that will include Julia, and we'll also have the pleasure to welcome Nick Swanson from the Office for AI and Cosmina Dorobantu from the Turing as part of that discussion. For now, let me briefly introduce Julia Black, our opening speaker. Julia is Strategic Director of Innovation and Professor of Law at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And since July last year, Julia has been the president of the British Academy, which is the UK's National Academy for Humanities and Social Sciences. Julia's primary research interest is in the dynamics and legitimacy of regulatory systems, including transnational and non-state aspects of regulation. I really couldn't think of a better fit in terms of interests and the topic of today's session. Julia has written extensively on regulatory issues in a number of areas and has also advised, from a practical perspective, policymakers, consumer bodies, and regulators in a number of areas, including financial services. Julia is an external member of the Bank of England's Prudential Regulation Committee and also a member of the bank's Financial Markets Infrastructure Board, as well as a senior independent member of the Board of UK Research and Innovation and a member of the Council of Science and Technology, among several other roles that I won't mention here, just to give you a flavor of sort of the breadth of her engagements. Julia, thank you very much for joining us, and over to you for you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Stefan. It's a great pleasure to be with you all today, albeit remotely, but I hope you've been having a really interesting session. As Stefan was saying, it is really a hotbed of regulatory activity in the AI space at the moment, in the UK and elsewhere. And obviously the EU's Commission for proposal for an AI Act is really setting the agenda, I think, in many ways in this space. And in the UK, where those of us who watch these things are eagerly awaiting the government's white paper on the regulation of AI expected in the spring, which is a wonderfully extensive period, I find, that can kind of extend until about June or July sometimes in government speak. But anyway, so there's a risk today, obviously, of preempting what the white paper says, but it does seem clear to me that back in 2018, when the House of Lords in the UK committee recommended that we just leave AI regulation to develop on a sector-by-sector basis, that might have been a recommendation at the time, but the pace of change in this area is rapid, and it's been really quickly overtaken, and I think it's now probably insufficient. So obviously, the key question we always look at in this space is, well, how do we design such a system, and how should it be calibrated? How intense should it be in different areas? And I always frame any comments that I have on any regulatory system in any area by saying, well, listen, all regulatory systems, no matter what they're regulating, no matter what domain they're operating in, and no matter if they're self-regulatory, state, transnational, etc., have 6 key elements. They have goals, things they want to achieve, and values that they want to uphold in achieving those goals. They have a particular cognitive framing, they have a particular way of thinking about the problem, about thinking about the world, about thinking about the area of domain that they will be regulating, and indeed on how regulation itself works. There's a bunch of tools and techniques, we're all very familiar with those. But there's also, importantly, a bunch of organized sets of organizational structures, processes, systems of the regulators in at different levels, of firms, of all those involved in the system. And then there are the behaviors, again, of governments, firms, of individuals, as consumers, as otherwise. So there's all those different component parts which are interacting. And most importantly, for any regulatory regime, it has to be trustworthy. There has to be trust and legitimacy in the regulation by those on whose behalf it's purporting to govern. So we have to think about the interactions of all those elements. They all make up the regulatory system, and they all change over time. And we also have to recognize that any regulatory system is complex, is adaptive, as I said, composed of multiple actors, multiple regulators, operates at multiple levels. And the interactions between those different regulators, even those, might be coercive, they might be competitive, they might be collaborative, or they might simply coexist, ignoring one another. So that's a kind of prefacing of, okay, you enter the world of regulation, you can see it written down on the page in terms of a list of regulations, perhaps. That's not the same as a regulatory system. That is just one input, one important element, that is not obviously the entirety of a regulatory system. So now's not the time for extensive analysis. Just got a short amount of time, which is quite proper because we want to move on to discussion. So I'm going to focus my remarks on 3 main issues. And the first is calibrating AI regulation in terms of risks to that the use of AI may be posing in any context. Obviously, the approach that the EU AI Act has taken, but which I actually argued for before it was published. Not that they would have read that. The second is actually choices. Some of our key design choices for AI regulatory systems. Again, we've got a bunch of experience we can learn from regulation across many domains over many decades now. And then finally, what it means to create not just trustworthy AI, which is obviously what we focus on, but trustworthy AI regulatory systems. So moving on first to look at calibration of regulation in line with norms and goals in the context of AI. And it strikes me there are kind of 2 layers of goals which we're looking at. The first, which are quite technical, on which we can probably find quite a lot of technical agreement in terms of what the AI systems, I'm just going to call them systems, should conform to. They'll look like in a minute. And then the second is a much wider set of normative values. So in the context of those general purpose technical goals, there is quite a lot of conformity around in terms of policy literature, and they're quite well expressed, I think, in the Commission's proposal. Probably not completely, but it's a good starting point, which are standards of performance. AI models should perform consistently throughout their life cycle, meet an appropriate level of accuracy, robustness, cybersecurity, in accordance with generally acknowledged state-of-the-art. And those accuracy metrics need to be communicated to the users. So there's a performance standard, there's a technical robustness requirement, resilient against risks connected to the limitation of the system, errors, faults, inconsistencies, and against malicious actions and cyber attacks, and obviously data. The need for high quality training, validation, and testing data sets, which are sufficiently relevant, representative, free of errors, and complete in view of the intended use. And obviously context is all, and that those are appropriately governed. So there's a core kind of what I'll call sort of mid-level goals there. But overlaid at that are the more normative goals in terms of what society as a whole we are trying to achieve. And these are framed in the AI Act in terms of health and safety and fundamental rights. And those are in addition to the general norms of transparency and oversight, that we should be able to interpret the system output and use it appropriately. And the system should be designed in a way that natural persons can oversee their functioning. So we've got sort of those core kind of technical goals for AI with the openness and transparency, and then we've got the importance of the goals of the context in which they're being used. And I think what we can see from the way that approaches to AI regulation are evolving very rapidly in the UK and have been across different countries within the EU, is that different regulators are looking, understandably, at the use of AI in their sectors and are prioritizing the normative goals of those sectors and the normative goals of their regulation in the way that they approach it. So if we look at healthcare, AI in healthcare, for example, in the UK, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency focuses quite rightly on patient safety and effectiveness in its focus on AI models. The Information Commissioner, in contrast, its approach is framed by GDPR legislation, and so it's very interested in the use of personal data in AI regulation, and so focuses on transparency, fairness, and non-discrimination. Market regulators, such as the Competition and Markets Authority or financial regulators, like the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, are focused on competition, consumer protection, treating its customers fairly in markets, and so are looking at the role of the impact of AI and the business models which AI is integral to or permitting or allowing to develop, enabling, the impacts that they're having on competition in the markets and on market-based consumer protection. Ofcom, in its role as a communications regulator, is looking at the role of AI in online digital harms, and the Bank of England, for example, is looking at resilience of the financial system as a whole, for example, the endogenous effects of models in creating systemic risk. So we have these sort of core standards, I think, that are required or could be required of AI models, but overlaid with these specific normative goals in these different areas. So the question then is, I suppose, is whether it's sufficient to allow each domain to develop its own area of regulation of AI, or whether some overarching framework is required, as has been developed by is exactly what, of course, the EU has been doing. And I would suggest actually we also in the UK now have the opportunity to set out overarching principles, which I suggest that we do with respect to three elements of AI: the data, the models, and the governance, which can apply cross-sector. Okay, so those would be the headings. What then is the calibration? And obviously in the Commission's proposal, it's calibrated on what's called a risk-based approach, which is you have high intensity regulation where you've got higher risks and a lower intensity regulation where you have lower risks. It's a fairly straightforward kind of approach. It's one that we adopt intuitively across different regulatory systems. I think what's quite interesting in the Commission's proposal is that they just bring that out in a single place, a single set of articulations. And the classification of a system as high risk is based on the purpose of the system and in terms of the context in which it's going to be used. And it's quite interesting that the way that the risk is defined is partly in terms of reversibility of the impacts or compensatability, but also thinking about agency, whether it's possible for someone to opt out of the system on the extent to which the person who's going to be adversely impacted or might be is itself on themselves in a vulnerable position. So there are those categories of risk have a lot of merit, I think, to them. There's a lot that we can work within those. So I would suggest that actually there's an important gap in terms of the context that we're thinking in which AI is going to be used, and that's resilience. So the EU, for example, provision references infrastructure, but only to the extent that it proposes a risk to health and safety, and not on resilience per se, which I would argue would be continuity of supply, for example, for utilities, for the financial system, for energy. And I think resilience is becoming a new focus for regulators. We're used to a focus on risk. We're used to a focus on markets and market efficiency. I think resilience is the thing that people are now focusing on increasingly for all various obvious reasons that has become very apparent, not only through COVID, but also now through interruptions to supply chain, through war. And finally, obviously, through climate. So I think there's an area here that we can be focusing on in addition. Okay, turning now then to what kind of tools and techniques and the timing of imposition of regulation. Any regulatory system has choices over time, whether it's ex ante, licensing a product to go onto market, whether it imposes during the process of the marketing, or the making or marketing of a product or delivering a service, or whether it's ex post through liability rules, enforcement, reporting of adverse events, or any combination. And so at the moment, because UK regulation is absorbing AI regulation into its existing regimes, it's following the pattern which is set there. So for medical devices, for example, strong conformity assessment is required prior to accessing the market, whereas for the FCA and CMA, they're regulating AI systems which are already in use. And they pose different regulatory challenges. And I think one of the things we obviously need to be thinking about in the context of AI is whether there are additional areas where we want to have conformity assessment before a product is allowed in use. We also have a choice of who makes the rules and who enforces them, and the relationship there between public and private enforcement. And some of our existing regimes are quite dependent on private enforcement. That means individuals realizing that they've suffered harm and taking that person to court. There are lots of different disadvantages, significant literature on the disadvantages of that in terms of enforcement being highly reliant on individuals and their affordability of taking action. And so there's often a strong role for public enforcement. And again, I think we need to, in incorporating AI into our current existing regimes, just have a look at the balance and see whether we've got that right in different areas between public and private enforcement. We also need to look at the role of third parties. And one of the issues, obviously, in relation to AI, as for example, in other new areas of regulation, notably climate data and looking at ESG models of business, is that people need to have assurance that the AI system, in this case, is actually doing what it said. And so obviously there's work going on in the UK and thinking about developing systems of assurance and certification. I think it's quite interesting in the EU space. They've deliberately said they will only use certification in areas where it is already used in the market, in product certification. In other areas, the technology is too new to be able to have third-party assurance. And this is a really interesting space because third parties like assurance can enter the regulatory system by design, as in, for example, requirements on certification and assurance, but also through the activities of the firms themselves. That's how AI is coming into these regulated sectors after all, as indeed are cloud service providers. But there's another third party which is much more familiar in this space, which are insurers. And I think one of the interesting things to watch for is that as liability rules ramp up on firms who are using AI or bringing it to market, so will the insurance requirements that they will have for that liability. And it will often probably come through what's called directors and officers liability insurance. So it's be interesting to see what role the insurance market itself starts to play in driving governance inside firms. We're already seeing that in cyber risk and cyber security. It's interesting to see how that actually starts to affect the overall governance of AI itself. So again, I think we've got an opportunity as AI appears as a general use technology across these different sectors and domains for different regulators to be looking across other regulators, even if they don't have the same goals as them, to say, well, what techniques are you using that we could borrow? So we have obviously coordination systems which are developing across the market for regulators in similar domains, but there's a real opportunity for cross-domain learning going on there. So let's turn to regulators now and thinking about creating not just trustworthy AI, but trustworthy AI regulatory regimes. Now, trust in regulatory regime is usually based on four main, what I call legitimacy claims. They're the claims that those on whose behalf people are purporting to regulate claims demands that they make of a regulatory regime or a governance regime for them to consider it to be legitimate to them. This is a very sociologically rooted concept of legitimacy. It's not one which is designed out there, as it were, but it's actually what people people want from a regulatory regime. These usually break down into any one of or more of four core things. First of all, focusing on normative goals and values. Is the regulation aimed at the right things? Is it trying to achieve the right goals? Is it trying to achieve things, goals that people believe in accordance with values that they want upheld? And are the values that encode those on which people will agree are the important ones? There's a second group of claims, which is around what I would call due process or rule of law. These are requirements that the regulation is open, it's transparent, it's accountable, follows due process, etc. And a final group is on expertise. The regulators know what they're doing, that it's going to be functionally efficient and effective, and appropriately targeted. And it's on that latter that I want to focus my final comments. So AI is obviously new, highly technical expertise, don't need to tell you that. And so there is an immediate challenge for any regulator. There's always a challenge for a regulator, basically keeping up with the market. But there's a real challenge here for technical expertise across the regulatory system. And we have there's obviously a high premium on rapidly creating ecosystems of assurance, but we have to bear in mind the assurers themselves need to be accredited, and they need to be accredited by people who also know what they're doing. And this is all happening at a time when those with the data skills that are needed are also being drawn into new areas of assurance. I mentioned climate risk assessments, for example, previously. So there is a huge skills issue. Regulators, I think, also need some coordination. They all at the moment are operating in their different domains, and domain-specific coordination is okay, but there's a lot to be learned from cross-domains. So I think we need a kind of the Office for AI or some other similar body acting as an overarching coordinating forum across regulators of different sectors and domains, not least because we need to be conscious of the issues of regulatory overlaps and underlaps, of regulatory arbitrage, and of the principle of that, if something posing the same risk, it should have the same regulation. But I think the need for capacity is probably greater at the moment than the need for coordination, though both are needed. Large regulators can afford to train their own teams, but others can't. And in other cases, it's hard for any of them to compete with the private sector on pay. So I would suggest we need the equivalent almost of a National Centre for Cybersecurity for AI, some kind of central unit which can provide expert advice and guidance to the public and private sector providers, can run through them, for example, can work them through scenario analysis, can work them through what a good AI system model looks like, can actually be testing and probing and provide that additional capacity, preferably with commas into and out of regulators in the private sector, nationally and internationally. And then finally, I think the use of AI in the public sector needs to be as closely scrutinised by independent regulators as it is proposed to be regulated in the private sector. Interestingly, because the National Health Service in the UK, effectively the use of AI in healthcare by the public service provider, the NHS, is regulated. I would argue we need exactly the same strong independence regulation with the use of AI by other government departments using the same classification in risk in terms of context and use as we would be applying for the private sector. So that's just a few things on the to-do list. As I say, we're all waiting to see what the white paper brings, but that's to say it's a very exciting and very fertile area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for those very rich remarks. There was a lot in there, and I'm sure we'll come back to many of the points that you shared. And I think the three sort of main categories of issues, the way you structured your talk, provide a really useful lens for thinking about the different considerations that are salient in thinking about AI regulation. So the point about risk, design choices for the regulatory system, and then ensuring that the regulatory regime itself is trustworthy. So thank you for that useful lens. I'd now like to briefly introduce our two other guests for the panel discussion. Welcome to both of you. First of all, Nick Swanson is the deputy head of the government's Office for Artificial Intelligence. In the past, Nick has led the team which wrote the UK's national AI strategy. That's a piece of work that we've already heard a lot about in other conference sessions. And Nick is currently leading the government's work on the already mentioned white paper on AI regulation and governance. So welcome, and thank you very much for joining us. And then Kuzmina Dorobantu, who many of you will have met yesterday already, is the co-director of the public policy program at the Alan Turing Institute. She's an economist by background and serves on various expert groups and advisory groups, including the Department for International Trade and Economy panel, and also recently on the FCA's and Bank of England's Financial Services AI Public-Private Forum, which I'm sure you'll tell us more about in a moment. Thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to start with a question for you, Nick. Given that the white paper has been mentioned so much already, it'd be great to hear a bit more from you about this work, sort of the background of the work and how you're approaching it at the moment.
Yeah, very happy to, and I think it'll touch on quite a lot of the same themes that Julie has just mentioned. I think for context and something that's worth saying that often doesn't get said, AI is already regulated in the UK. It is just regulated indirectly by a patchwork of legislation and regulation which sort of indirectly governs the way that it's used. And I suppose the question for us is, at what point does the lens become AI? When does AI become the lens through which we should make the decision about how we regulate it? And that sort of goes back to the point that Julia made about the House of Lords committee's position in 2018, which was the sector-based approach currently works. The government agreed with that position. The AI strategy, we said we would look again at that. The UK has a large AI sector, has a lot of people building it, a lot of people using it, and our research has shown that there's an even higher demand for business adoption of AI. So what we said in the strategy is we would look again at this. We want to make sure that the system is pro-innovation, that it protects the public, that it provides clarity, and that it aligns with like-minded countries around the world. And as we've been developing this work, we've been speaking to a lot of stakeholders, and a lot of the messages that we've heard back will reflect some of the things that Julie just said. And I'll go through some of the interesting things that might spark a bit of conversation for later on. Interestingly, something we keep hearing is people are wary of the government centrally defining artificial intelligence for regulatory purposes, which sort of makes sense when you consider that it's a general purpose technology, and where it is used and how it is used and what it is being used to do effectively defines what it is for regulatory purposes. We keep hearing that people want clear and consistent values. What are we regulating for? And I think Julie mentioned some of those questions around safety, around transparency, around bias. And the other is context. We keep hearing that people want to see AI regulated in context. A risk assessment should be contextual. Context being the most important thing when it comes to how we choose to regulate AI.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much. That's a great overview, and I'm sure, again, we'll come back to many of those points in a moment. Kuzmina, first question for you. So as mentioned, you recently served as a member on the AI Public-Private Forum convened by the Bank of England and the FCA, which I think is really interesting because, as many will know, financial services in many ways stands out sort of as a sector for AI, both in terms of the wide range of use cases of AI, but also the maturity and the level of adoption that we see in this sector. So it'd be great to sort of hear your reflections, on the regulation of AI based on your experience in this sector.
You're absolutely right. The financial service is a very interesting sector to look at. For one, it has a lot of AI use cases, starting from the most basic and least interesting, like email spam and cybersecurity, moving on to sort of fraud detection, and then to the sort of more higher risk cases like insurance underwriting or loan decisions. So there's a tremendous opportunity to sort of look at it already. And as Julia said, it's one of those sectors in which you step in and regulate what's already there and what's already being built. From an innovation perspective, the biggest barrier that we have to further AI development within the financial services is regulatory uncertainty. This is something that the firms say over and over again, that they don't know if they should be investing in this, and they don't know what the future requirements are going to be. But it is a very interesting sector to be looking at and to be thinking about. It's a sector where we don't start from scratch. So financial services has a very long history of using statistical model to inform various decisions, and a long history of regulating this. So, there's a model risk management framework in place to help with that. So we're not starting from scratch. We're also not starting from something that covers all of AI. But we have, you don't have a blank sheet. You have something written on it, and you can adjust it. And I think the other thing that we have within this country is, a regulator like the Financial Conduct Authority, which has a long history of regulatory innovation. And the eyes of the world are on institutions like the Financial Conduct Authority. And I think when you sort of step back and you hear a lot from the UK government, the sort of desire to lead in AI. And the question is, what bits of AI can the government lead in? And this is an obvious area, this is sort of the low-hanging fruit. You have a regulator that is internationally known, that people are looking up to, that is focused on consumer protection. As Julia was saying, the goals and values in regulation matter a lot, and I think this is a very good point to start to think about AI regulation from a sort of consumer perspective point of view. And I think this is something where the UK really could lead. So it's a particularly exciting area of work. And the AI Public-Private Forum that the Bank of England and the FCA convened was extremely interesting and insightful. And we had so many meetings, and we've learned so much from each other. So they're industry players. I think one of the sort of clever things that the bank and the FCA did is to have us speak in a personal capacity, not representing our institutions, which created an openness and the desire for people to, just really sort of crack this problem. I would love to see sort of further initiatives there. We had academia, and we had industry, and we had public sector organizations as sort of observers on the forum. I think the next step is to bring civil society in and to tackle these issues. And we've produced a final report. I recommend people read it. It's a report written by a committee, so inevitably it has like a breadth of views. And the bank and the FCA are now working on a discussion paper themselves, which I think is a very good outcome out of that forum.
Great, thank you very much, Kuzmina. I think that's a very interesting deep dive in looking at a particular area, and very encouraging to hear sort of the collaborative spirit in which the work was progressed within the forum, and how that could serve as an example for other contexts. Julia, I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to those thoughts, but I'd also thought I'd sort of introduce, another question for all of us to think about in a bit more detail, which is this question that has come up, I think, in all of your comments around, and it goes back, Julia, to your point around the design choices for the regulatory system. So a couple of considerations, I think, worth highlighting: the fact that, as Nick mentioned, regulation of AI, the thinking there doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are existing regulators, their remits may not be defined, or rules may not be defined through focus on AI, but there is relevant regulation that exists. Some of those regulators have a vertical focus, others have a horizontal focus. So there's this complexity of, how does all of this fit together when we think about AI? And then perhaps another element, and it goes back to some of your comments, Julia, earlier around regulators themselves, and then other governance mechanisms, non-regulatory mechanisms, such as the assurance ecosystem. And it might be worth briefly, Nick, that's maybe something you'd like to comment on, to think about the government's thinking in that space, for example, in relation to the CDI's roadmap for AI assurance, and how the UK may sort of lead by example in that space. But over to you, Julia, for your reflections.
Oh, thanks, Stefan. So a lot there. So I think I'd pick up a comment actually that Nick opened with, which is, as I said, AI is already being regulated, but what's happening is that regulators in their current domains this is coming in through the market, and so what they're doing is having to hunt around in their regulatory toolbox, as it were, and approaches to think, okay, well, how can we use any of these different powers that we have in a way which is appropriate to the regulation of AI, or to use Nick's phrase, when does AI become the lens through which we view how we regulate it? So, and I think one of the issues that we have at the moment is regulators are kind of coming at this sideways. You know, it's come into the market, and so we're seeing what we can do. Now, as Cosmina said, actually in the financial space, you know, financial supervision in terms of resilience, in terms of the capital requirements, etc., for banks or insurance companies are based on statistical models, and we've got long history of developing statistical models and regulating them. And so there's a lot we can learn there, actually, which is around, and the public-private forum brought them out really well, I thought, in terms of looking at the data. We have very close scrutiny in financial regulation on data sets. We always have specification on data sets, which includes, you know, what's the long look back period, for example, over a data set. We have specification insurance on levels of risk, 1 in 200. Risk gets fed in on a statistical basis. We have protocols around model governance, and we require firms and their boards to also have appropriate looks at model governance. And then we have, as a supervisor, you have deep dives into models and how actually accurate are those models. But it's quite interesting in terms of getting those models, if I draw on banking, for example, there has been a move, obviously evolved over time, but you can either have two choices. You either have a standardized model, so you just take the risk model that has been set by regulators, in this case at international level, or if you want to use your own internal ratings model, then you get that approved by a regulator. So I think there's an interest there now. These are not obviously going to be direct read across, therefore, now into an AI space. So again, it's kind of okay, well, we do have some tools and techniques there, but there's not going to be a direct read across, but there's some things that we can really learn from, which are the importance of focusing not just both on the data and on the maps in terms of the regulation of AI. And I think sometimes the debates have focused much more on the data than they have on the maps. And so I would argue that what we can really learn from that is that double focus. But what we can also see there is the very strong focus on the responsibility of firms themselves and their governance and their senior managers to ensure that their firms are run properly, but also we could then extrapolate and extend that over into AI. And then again, post financial crisis, it's the senior managers certification regime, which I think gives particular purchasing firms. So there's things that you can learn from different models. And again, it might not be appropriate if you're a cross-sector model like the CMA, where you're actually looking at market structures. You're not looking at individual firms themselves, but you're looking much more at market structures and business models and how are AI products, changing the market in different ways. So I think what could happen is we start to bump up against the edges of our powers. And so I think there is a real advantage about using AI as the lens to look. We view how we regulate it, and then thinking about taking it back to the domains is to say, okay, well, actually looking at through this lens, we're going to need to adjust in different ways. But in so doing, we can learn across from healthcare into finance, or from even health and safety into other areas, or product certification, so that we can be learning as we're creating.
Excellent, thank you, Julia. Nick, are there any thoughts you'd like to share in thinking further about the regulatory architecture, as it were? And just to mention, one of the questions just came in online is, what do we mean by assurance of AI? So to anyone who would like to comment on that, I'm sure answer would be much appreciated.
Yeah, I can. Yeah. So from an architectural sort of perspective, in terms of the institutions, the horizontal and the vertical, I think the key question is that lens. When is AI the most important lens through which to look at regulatory issues? And getting the balance between vertical, horizontal, AI is not unique in that regard. There are other general purpose things. There are other things which have a mix of the two. But I think the key point for me here is that AI is a general purpose technology, and it is a very, very general purpose technology. It augments, replaces, adapts, changes sort of human cognitive function in processes. AI is not a product or a service. It's a process, effectively. And if the capabilities that AI had created were solely faster, more precise, or scaled up versions of stuff that we already do, maybe there would be a case for just sole vertical regulation of everything. But the reason why we're looking again at that is that I think it's clear that AI raises questions about fairness, about safety, about other cross-cutting issues of which we have already horizontal regulators for. So the key test for us is that it works, that it's coherent for businesses from that AI lens, and that it's proportionate, that we're not putting undue burdens on business. On the wider piece on assurance, I suppose, I don't know whether someone more clever than me can define it a bit better, but we would see that as the sort of industry-led, largely driven by standards, means by which people can prove that they're in accordance with the spirit and word of existing law, where the law doesn't exist that is specific to AI. And I think one of the things, the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation published a assurance roadmap earlier this year, or at the end of last year, which basically spells out a means by which we want to build that private sort of ecosystem of assurers in the UK who can build that additional layer of trust in and around and between the cracks and on top of existing regulation.
Great, thanks for that. Kuzmina, anything you'd like to add to that discussion?
Yeah, just really quickly to say about assurance that I think, within the Turing and within the public policy program, we probably take a bit of a wider lens when it comes to assurance. And, we've just published, Chris Burr and David Leslie just published a paper on ethical assurance. So it goes beyond what the law requires to, what are the sort of processes and checks and balances that one should put in place to sort of ensure that these systems are not just legal, but they're also ethical.
Yeah.
And about sort of horizontal and vertical regulation, I think, we're used to working in policy silos, whether that's within government or within regulators. So we're used to sort of focusing on one area or one sector. And I think, that you do need that depth for some things, but there's obviously an awful lot of overlap when it comes to AI. And I think, we would want to, there efforts are being duplicated within regulators, I feel. A lot of regulators are thinking about the same things and not necessarily being always joined up. I think there's also the risk that Julia mentioned, which is that you might end up with different rules for different sectors, and then you have this arbitrage situation happening. So I think there will be an awful lot of benefit to a horizontal approach. But I think what we should keep in mind is that the horizontal approach is never going to be able to address everything. I think there will be some guidelines that will be universal, and then you will still need a little bit of sector-specific guidance, just because the use cases differ so much from sector to sector. So you can imagine health or financial services, for example, requiring some additional rules on top of the sort of horizontal guidance that you'd see.
Great, thank you for that. And I think you just touched on one aspect that I think serves as a segue into another question that would be great to dive into, which is moving beyond or setting aside sort of the formal structures and the architecture, thinking about the capacity and the capabilities that regulators need, taking the structure as a given, or whatever the answer is to the right structure. What are the capabilities, the skills that regulators need in order to be effective in their work? Julia, you also touched on that question of capacity earlier on. Would you like to share some further thoughts on that point?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is, it's a truism, isn't it, that regulators are always playing catch up with the market, and there's always an asymmetry of information and expertise, and to an extent, expertise between regulators and firms. And I think we're just seeing that absolutely writ large, partly because this is very new, partly because of the skills involved, and partly because, as we know, the pool of people is not very great. So, and also we have regulators who are just differently resourced and differently staffed And that might have been appropriate for the problems that they needed to deal with when they were set up, but all of a sudden they might have massively expanded because of the role of AI in their space. I'm thinking, for example, of the partly because the rules change, but partly the technology changes. I think the ICO is a really interesting example here. So the Information Commissioner Office in the UK is responsible for the data protection regulation. You know, it started off with about 5 people about 20 years ago, is now up to 500, but it's still dwarfed by something the size of the Financial Conduct Authority, which is quite well resourced. The CMA is also a pretty well resourced regulator. But I used to be involved in regulation of legal services of solicitors firms, for example. Quite a small regulator, not particularly very well resourced, but actually thinking about the role of AI in legal cases, and it's absolutely hugely important in terms of fundamental rights and access to justice. So all of a sudden, this AI can transform the scale of the challenge that a regulator is facing in its area, because it poses perhaps a greater threat or risk to its objectives. So, so regulators aren't always able to staff up in the way that they may need. And also, to the extent, to be honest, you need sector-specific knowledge for sure, but AI is a general-purpose technology. And so there is a scope for having a pool, I think, of expertise that regulators can draw on at different points when they need it. As I say, some might not need it. And if you're sitting in the CMA, you think, well, that's fine because we can employ who we want. But others won't, and they'll be finding actually AI is being used in unexpected ways in their sectors. So, then I was looking, for example, the role the National Cybersecurity Centre plays in enhancing capacity, both for public and private sector actors, and there's a pool of public resource that people can draw on. And so I think there's a model there that we could be thinking about in terms of how to actually just help regulators get the expertise that they need.
Thank you, Julia. Nick, do you have any thoughts on the capacity question?
Yeah, I think there's a few elements to it. I think one important one to recognise is coordination, which is already ongoing and already developing nascently. We have the DRCF, which we've worked with through the development of the white paper. But on the capacity issue, I think there's two sides to it. There's the hard side and the soft side, and I think Julia's just mentioned some of the hard issues as well there, which is that not all regulators have the same powers. Not all regulators have the same staffing, funding mechanisms. They don't have the same powers of investigation and enforcement. And that could create an issue if there is a sudden spike of the use of AI in a sector such as food safety, for instance, just to pick a random example. That could cause an issue if you sort of need the kind of powers that you would expect of the CMA or the ICO to have, and the FSA obviously doesn't have that. And then the other one is the softer side of it, which is the sharing expertise and sharing knowledge. And I think that's definitely part of making this whole thing work, at least in the immediate term. And the idea of a pooled resource of data scientists or of sort of expertise or whatever that might necessarily need to contain, I think that's a very, very interesting one.
Cosmina, over to you.
Yeah, no, I can agree more with Julia and Nick. And it's true, like there's such a variety of regulators within this country and beyond. Some regulators in the UK have one person, just one. And it's impossible for them to sort of consider, AI and how it affects them. I also think that there are some regulators that have just been thrown into this AI battlefield in a way, and on the horizontal question, Julia mentioned the Information Commissioner's Office, and it's true. It has grown in size tremendously and in remit over the past few years. But we also have regulators like the Equalities and Human Rights Commission who haven't thought about AI, who haven't all of a sudden are thinking, okay, there are really serious implications for my work. How do I build expertise? And we've given some thought to this at the Turing, and there are three ways in which you can think about expertise and readiness. You can think about it on an individual level. So do people within your organization understand what AI is and how it might affect their work? Do your senior leaders understand its importance to know that they need to direct resources over there? So that's individual level readiness. When we talk about organization readiness, which is the organization as a whole prepared for those technologies. And for thinking about them. And we also think about system level readiness. And here, collaboration matters, and the way the system as a whole is linked up. And we are seeing some cooperation within the UK, and what I would add to what Nick said is, we have the Regulators AI Working Group, which is a brilliant initiative started by the Information Commissioner's Office to bring regulators together to think about these technologies. But I absolutely agree that there is a need of a pool of expertise. And just to give you one example, whenever the idea of a regulatory gap analysis comes up, nobody wants to do it because it is an incredibly difficult thing to do. Even if you just do it for your one sector, it's so hard. And it's for things like this that you really need to bring people together, and you need a common pool of expertise to address these questions, but also for regulators to draw on, small and large.
Can I just come in there very quickly? I just wanted to let the record show that there's two regulators that we mentioned there, EHRC and I mentioned the Food Standards Agency. I do know both of whom are doing quite a lot on AI and have been working on it. So I didn't want to make it sound like this was totally brand new to them.
Yeah.
No, absolutely no. Yeah. And I didn't want to give that impression at all. But I do think that it's something that they've had to turn their attention to, that they wouldn't have expected, a few years ago for sure.
I sort of like the idea of the regulatory gap analysis as the holy grail, and the challenges of finding that. Although we're all looking forward to the white paper as a partial delivery.
Partial holy grail.
Yeah. Great. We have about 8 minutes left. I think one question that I would love to come back to in the remaining time is the international perspective on all of this. And I think there are a couple of different angles to that. So on the one hand, as we already heard, there's the EU AI Act, which is getting a lot of attention, question of what that means for the UK, especially post-Brexit. There have also been significant controversies in relation to some of the substance of the EU AI Act. And I think some of that goes back to definitions of risk that Julia mentioned, but also definitions of AI that you mentioned, Nick, and sort of the question, is there anything we can learn from what the EU is proposing in terms of what the UK should be doing in approaching these questions? And then setting aside the EU AI Act, I think there are other international questions, such as international trade more broadly and implications of regulation for that may be worth touching on briefly. So maybe if we sort of do a last round for any reflections on the international dimensions, starting with you, Julia.
Okay, happy to go. So I think it's the EU is not the only region that does this, but it is very generous with its legislation. The US can be the same, the AI Act will apply to any AI system which has an impact on citizens in the EU. So it doesn't need to be produced in the EU, doesn't need to be distributed in the EU, doesn't even need to be used in the EU. But if its use has an impact on citizens in the EU, then it will be covered by the EU, by the Act. So, it's a significant territorial reach. And we also know in other areas that when firms are faced, from a government's point of view, it has a monopoly on regulation, and it's a pain when it has to think about anybody else. But from a firm's point of view, if they're operating multinationally, that's just normal business. You're always having to cope with multiple jurisdictions. And we see in other areas that there's a tendency to if it means adjusting your systems and processes, if they're generic, then you tend to just adjust to the highest level that you need, because then you don't need to create a whole plethora of different systems and processes to produce products for different markets. It does vary. So the international dimension is always going to be present. And from a firm's point of view, so from a government's point of view, international coordination is useful because it can prevent arbitrage, and it can set itself businesses going to the lowest common denominator in terms of regulation in that kind of regulatory competition dynamic. But from a firm's point of view, international coordination is also helpful because it means that you don't need to be conforming to multiple standards, products and standards. So from a UK government point of view, or from any national regulator point of view outside of the EU, they have to recognise that any of their businesses which are developing AI products, services, or is being embedded in those products and services which are going to have an impact on the EU, whether or not the government likes it, that firm is going to be complying with EU regulation. And so there is a need for international coordination, and we see that with peripatetic multinational industries, financial services being a prime example, where you can really be based anywhere. That we have, quite high levels of international coordination, very high levels of international coordination actually, but it's built up over decades and has been built up over a series of successive crises and responses to those. So we might want to preempt some of that. So obviously, yeah, absolutely key dimension to that. And I'll stop there because I'll leave others to pick up some of the other comments.
Great, thanks, Julia. Nick, over to you.
I think I'll get to the EU in a moment, but I think another forum, an international forum, which often doesn't get talked about as often as it maybe should, is the Council of Europe, which is a treaty organisation separate to the European Union, which is looking at AI and which could potentially have some relatively important and significant impacts on the UK. On the EU AI Act, I suppose I'll pick up on the definitions point. I guess the EU has drawn a relatively neat boundary around what it considers to be AI, and that largely makes a lot of sense for the EU because it's a trade bloc and it's a single market and it is being regulated as a product, and that needs to have definitions and boundaries around it. One of the things that I suppose maybe is different in the approach ever so slightly is I guess we're looking at AI as maybe we would like to say more holistically as a bit more than just the part of the life cycle where it becomes a product or something that you can sell to somebody or that you can trade in and out of the market. So not to criticise it, but I suppose it's just a different lens, which is necessarily a function of what the EU is.
Thank you. Kuzmina.
We live at a time when sort of the importance of international cooperation is back on our minds and it's sort of center stage again. And I think with AI, international cooperation is going to be key. And one thing that does keep me up at night, especially sort of watching events unfold in Ukraine, is military applications of these technologies. And the EU AI Act specifically chooses not to deal with that. And that worries me, and I do think there is a real need for us to think about it, and that's where international cooperation will be key. And I think especially in crisis situations, and we are in a crisis situation now, we're particularly bad at making good decisions about technological innovation. And the importance of regulation is that it sets the guardrails for that technological innovation. And I think, the technological innovation bolted ahead of us in the early 1940s. We are threatened by this, nuclear war once again because we didn't have the right guardrails in place. So as the world enters the sort of darker stage that we have nowadays, I'm sorry to sort of end on a pessimistic note, but I think that should be on our collective to-do list to start to think about how can we actually think about those technologies and set the proper guardrails in place while we still can.
Great, thank you very much. And I think, with regards to the pessimistic note, I think we had the right mix of optimism and pessimism, perhaps, as part of the discussion, sort of to bring out, the pressing nature of this topic and the importance of thinking about the right approach to regulating AI, in terms of, what can go wrong if we don't get it right, but also looking at some of the positive examples of, how solutions might be approached. So thank you very much. There's a lot more we could be discussing, but we have run out of time. Thank you very much for joining us on the panel, Julia, Nick, Kuzmina. I hope you all enjoyed the session, all of you watching out there, and perhaps we'll meet again next year for a stock take, what the landscape looks like after the government has published its white paper, which we all look forward to reading. Thank you.
Thank you.